Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and this is Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. Please go down, subscribe to our channel, hit the notifications bell, leave a comment if you want to leave a comment. Check out the About section for the Dutch Hunter Rendezvous and the Legend of the Superstition Mountains shirts, black, gray, long sleeve, short sleeve. One comment here on the comments is when we get notifications on this, some of those don't pop in. So if you don't see anything liked or a reply on them, it generally means they don't always come to us. Sometimes they get filed in a section that's for approval, and I'll go through those, but we'll get a notification occasionally for comments. And you may have edited it, you may have deleted it, I don't know. But we always try to make sure we reply to any and all comments. So if you leave a comment, you should see some response from us in some way. If it's just a thank you, generally, or hey, love watching your videos, you probably just get a thank you and a like and whatnot. Anyways, doing that, I always want to touch base on that because there are a few every week they get through and I never can find them. And I go through and it kind of bums me out a little because sometimes people have a lot to say or something complimentary or tell a story and we find no way to respond to them. I don't know what it is in YouTube that kind of passes those by. That being said and done, let's get to this week's story. Now, I thought about a number of things, and there was a couple different things I wanted to talk about, and I thought, let's get back into Dutchman mode here in the groove. And this is a story that's probably outside of Jacob Walt's, probably the second most popular Superstition Mountains story, and it's called the Two Soldiers story. Now, you may, wherever you live, elsewhere, you've probably have a Two Soldiers or a Soldier's Lost Mine story yourself. In the Metro Phoenix region, there's at least 3 or 4 that I know of. There was one with a Soldier's Lost Mine in the South Mountain area. There's 2 French soldiers, I believe, that were in the Estrellas, which is a lost silver mine, and there's the stories associated with that. And there's the Sullivan's Lost Ledge, which he had been a soldier, and they believe that involved the Silver King as well, so they always wonder if that had been connected to the superstition one. So generally what happens is when some former soldier or someone who had been a soldier is found a mine and it's lost, it just becomes a common thing to call it the Lost Soldier's Mine. So this one is about the 2 soldiers from Fort McDowell in the Superstition Mountains, and is one of the few stories, and the Sullivan story is pretty well documented, but this story is pretty well documented, and we know it is what it is for what it's worth. Now, what we have here is there's 2 soldiers there at Fort McDowell. They're leaving Fort McDowell. They decide to take up and get some work at the Silver King Mine. So the story goes that they left there, and they had told this story to the people they'd meet at the Silver King, that they had left, they went in and they started to follow what looks like it was probably the Apache Trail, but the road they were following that was going to lead them to the Silver King suddenly started moving north, and they thought that was the wrong direction, so they figured they would just continue and kind of move more southerly direction through the canyons, and they left that area and started heading south. They got into really rough country, they said, and they got kind of turned all around. They ended up going down a canyon, they said, that kind of box canyoned out, dead-ended, and the stories will sometimes vary, but it's always the same, basically, as they had to backtrack. They finally realized they were going to have to go up to a higher point and kind of see where they were and look for the general direction. They could see some landmarks where they were. So they were paying attention where they were, backtrack out, and then they were going to get out to this point and kind of look out and see where they were at generally and get kind of a measuring area of spot of where to go next. It's at this point they find some sort of old trail, and they kind of found it was kind of odd in the place it was, and it was up in the mountain, and they follow it, and it leads them up to a partially walled up tunnel. And they see the tunnel and they think this is kind of odd. It must have been some old mining camp or something. And then up above it is a pit. And they walk around and there's some pieces of rock and stuff that seem to be highly mineralized. They pick some of these up because they're not quite sure what's in it and whatnot. They stick some of these in their pack, a handful, and then they just continue on their way. When they get down, they get to a certain point. They said they could spot, and it's generally most of the stories, they could spot there looked like a corral or something, or a ranch house, and they could see from that point, and they knew which general direction they were going. I think it's also said they can see Picket Post Mountain in the distance or something to that effect. And then there was a high peak kind of behind them, which would have been to a northern degree behind them from where they were standing, which some people believe is Weaver's Needle, some people believe it could have been Miner's Needle. But it gives you a kind of a good idea of the general area they were, and the only real ranch house in the area they would have seen from a high peak in the valley at that point would have been in Barkley Basin, and they would have probably been looking at the quarter circle U, is what most of us assume. So the soldiers meet with Aaron Mason, the brother Charles Mason, which is related to the Sullivan story, the Mason brothers, and they show him the ore, and he says, oh, this is pretty rich gold ore stuff. So they tell him, hey, we came across this place. He thinks it's they probably had been spooked by the Apaches or something and left stuff behind. He wouldn't think there'd be that much more. But they're very interested in going back, thinking that's more worthwhile than mucking. So he says, here's what I'll do for you. I'll pay you for this gold, and here's the cash and so forth, and here's what you got left. And they put together some burros and some packs and some supplies and stuff to go back. Mason sits down with them, tells them how to file their claims. Their problem is, even if they put in the monuments, as they're not naturalized citizens, he agrees to file claims around theirs and all so forth to protect them, and that they'll kind of partner up. So there's not a lot of detail in the partnering up part, but it sounds like he had a bit of vested interest if there was something there. He was being probably a bit of an entrepreneur, making sure, you know what, hey, maybe these guys are onto something. So they get everything together, they go and leave. They've told him it would take them about 2 days to get there. He figures it'd take them a couple days or so, 2 or 3 days, to get their claims, monument set up and everything done, bring back some more ore and stuff, so they should be back within probably 6 or 7 days within the week. And 2 weeks go by and they don't hear from them. So Mason sends some people out, and they go look and they search the area, and they can't find nothing either. And he's thinking about sending another group out to search when one of the Whitlow boys from the Whitlow Ranch are up in the area, and they find a body. They claim it was about a half mile from where the quarter circle U is. It could have been further than that. It's hard to judge. But they said they found a body out in that general vicinity. The body had been shot. There was a gunshot wound to it. And they found this black hat there. The hat was very similar to what both soldiers had worn, the same style hat. So they figured that was one of the soldiers. They didn't know what happened to the other. Later, a gentleman who was freighting through the area set out towards the area of Bluff Springs. In that area, he'd been working his way through, and that story's kind of like, I'm not going to say sketchy, but very vague, that how was he pushing that wagon through? How close to Bluff Springs was he? Or was he just using that as kind of a waypoint of like about how far through the mountains he was? Anyways, he said he found a naked body of another person there. He did not stop. He figured there might be Apaches in the area, and he continued on through. The thought is that when Mason sent people out and people to investigate, Whitlow, they buried the body. They basically dug a shallow grave and buried the body. And then he sent people out. They said it looked like a shod horse had been following and tracking the soldiers. So Jim Bark, which is probably the earliest source we have for this story, while there were a number of witnesses, Robert Bowen, there's Mason, a number of people who were in and around the Silver King remembered the soldiers and talked to a number of people, Jim Bark, Sims Ely, Barry Storm. A lot of people talked to various people. Brownie Holmes had met one of the guys that I think had been down through there. So it was corroborated by about 6 or 7 different people from 6, 7, 8 different sources. And all the stories are very, very similar about the whole story. Jim Bark went out and they actually went to where they were told the gravesite was to verify. They dug that up, found buttons, and found that there had been a body buried there. Of course, they don't do DNA and stuff back then, but they verified as well as they could as that was the grave, that was where the soldier was buried, and they've never been a location for the second soldier ever verified. Now, where were they and how did all this work? Were they coming back from the mine when they were waylaid, or were they going to it? That's always that's the $1 million question there. And even then, they were not able to backtrack them any further than that. They weren't able to backtrack to the second body. So general consensus amongst most Dutch hunters of the 2 points that you could, and I've been to both and looked around those areas, that you would be able to see the ranch house would be somewhere from Bluff Springs Mountain or Coffee Flat. They both have a peak. You have Miner's Needle in conjunction with Coffee Flat, and then you would have Weaver's Needle behind you on Bluff Springs Mountain. And there are some various mining and old mining operations that happened in those areas. So it's thought that it was one of those 2 mountains, Coffee Flat or Bluff Springs Mountain. Jim Bark and Sim Zealy felt this tied directly to the Lost Dutchman, which is why they spent a significant amount of time chasing it up on Bluff Springs. John Tuning, who got the Joe Deering story, Joe Deering says he found that mine before he died, and John Tuning spent time out there searching. John Tuning spent a significant amount of time on Coffee Flat, feeling that was it. Joe Deering's story seems to follow in some ways possibly Bluff Springs Mountain and the Ely Anderson Trail, but it's hard to say. I mean, a lot of things get stretched out of the way. The one thing that's generally seen is that it is a true story because there were so many different witnesses and so many people that were able to say, I was there when they put the stuff in the safe. Now, the jar had the soldier's name at one time, so at one time it was knowledgeable. Now, whether they were very forgettable names or whatnot, but the jar is, nobody knows what happened to the jar. So for many, many years, that jar was around. The Mason family had it, and it had the names of the 2 soldiers in it, so they could reclaim that. That's lost time to us, too. I mean, it's anybody's guess at this point. And if something resurfaced about it, it would be almost, you would think, at this point in time, it would seem probably false information, because you would think it would have come out much earlier. So being a well-known story in Barry Storm's book, Sim Zealy's book, I think of just about every book covers it. Jack Sanfelice's When Silver Was King, Thomas Glover did it in The Golden Dream. So it's always kind of one of the hallmark stories, and a lot of people have differences of opinion whether it ties in to this 2 soldiers tie into Jacob Wallace and the Lost Dutchman Mine or not. I've kind of seen both sides. I generally think they were probably in the area of Coffee Flat or Bluff Springs Mountain. Most of it, everything that they were saying to some degree makes more sense in that way. And I think going with all the similarities between each story, it doesn't have to be the Lost Dutchman Mine. It's a Superstition Mountain story, though, on the other hand, which is always still very cool. The grave of the first soldier is known. There's a known site identified with that. And, I would always suggest read the various stories. I was going to read the Jim Bark version, but it's always good to catch these various different versions. So we don't know what their names were. They were French Canadian. We know they came out of Fort McDowell. We know the basic gist of the story, and we know where the 1 soldier's buried. And that's what I want to get to, is what happened probably about 16 years ago. One of the problems with doing research and stuff is people just don't know where there's a line what we shouldn't cross sometimes. And I go with the idea of that Alicia Rivas's grave was marked, and someone made sure there was a marker there, and it was there for a very, very long time, and then someone stole it. It's now marked, I think, by a rock that's face down, and unless you know the site, you won't know it's there. And that's happened on other specific sites. I think the RP Cactus in Needle Canyon's that way, or Marsh Valley. It's a similar situation. We have the GPS and we have a marked rock where it exactly was, but you don't give away the locations anymore because people tend to steal stuff and do some pretty odd things. One story is that a number of years ago there was 4 or 5 gentlemen, and I'm not going to give out any of the names of any of those people, but I was very disappointed to hear that day. I was actually going possibly with that group to go out, and it was to go out and check out the soldier's grave and look at some various vantage points and connectivity. And it's a little further than a half mile. It's probably a mile or so due northeast of the Quarter Circle U Ranch. And we were going to head out to that spot, and I missed that trip. I didn't get to go out with that group. So I was kind of behind. Well, afterwards, someone who was part of the group actually pulled me aside and started talking to me. What he said was, we got out there, and then everybody was kind of milling about, and we were looking at the grave, and then they started pulling the stones off, and one individual started digging, trying to see if he could dig anything out and all. And he said a couple of guys turned their backs, and I was very surprised at the individuals, some of the things they've said in the past, and the kind of the holier than thou attitudes they'd had about certain things, that they just decided to go out and do that. And he was really put off, and he said, I just see that as so much trouble. There's definite jail time, this sort of thing. But he said there was no reason to do it. We know that's where the grave is. We've known where it's at. Why would they be digging that up? What were they looking for? A souvenir, which is what you would think. We went back out, I'm thinking it was a year or two later, and I wanted to check and see if the site was being continually messed with. I went out, made sure I kind of like pushed things back, because you could tell someone had been kind of digging around on it, and it looked like it hadn't been animals. It looked like it had been human. I mean, what animal's going to dig up 100-year-old bones, 120-year-old bones? So I went out and I kind of made sure of things, but then I wanted to go back out because I wanted to kind of double check again to see if there was any problem with the grave being, I'm not going to say the word desecrated, but someone's just messing with something they don't need to be. So at a later date, I know the group that went with me, myself, Randy Wright, Paul Shimmick, Vaughn Kidd was there, I think Larry Wright, no relation to Randy Wright, a couple other people, but there were 6 or 7 of us. We went out and we checked out the site where the grave was. We actually gathered large boulders throughout the area, piled them up, not just to mark it, but try to preserve it and keep anybody from digging in there anymore. And then we went, after that, every year or two, we would go out and check it, and it remained. The idea was we would haul cement, regardless of the Forest Service thoughts on this, and we would start hauling water and cement and try to solidify it, make it more difficult for anybody to dig or mess with that, because we thought, out of all due respect, there was no reason to be messing with that grave at this point. So, and it still does remain. I don't think the GPS coordinates are out there. Most people have knowledge of it, know where it's at, and it's not as easy to locate, but it's easy located for all of us who know where it's at. So that's the soldier's grave. I've been there. The points of the mountains and so forth. It is what it is. I hope everybody enjoys the story and goes and reads up further material on it. Stay off the internet. Buy a book. Go to Amazon somewhere and buy a book, because you'll be so much happier to read the various stories and the little bits of different research other people have done on this story. So thanks for joining us again. Can't wait to talk to everybody next week. Take care of yourselves. Hit our subscribe button. Until then, this is Wayne Tuttle. This was Chasing Legends. Take care.